Hello and welcome. This is our final lecture as part of the 25th Annual Wilderness Issues Lecture Series, Connecting Landscapes Conservation Across Boundaries. I want to thank the Boone and Crockett Club. They graciously allowed us to use a term in our title that they had trademarked. That term is Conservation Across Boundaries. The Boone and Crockett Club has done a lot of work on conservation across boundaries, and they allowed us to use that term in our title, so I'd like to thank them. So, turning to our lecture for this evening, unfortunately, Carol Miller, our scheduled speaker, will not be able to be here tonight, but we are very lucky to have two other fire experts, fire researchers from the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, who are here to talk with us about fire. And their names are up here, in case you need some details about them. Dave Parsons is the director of the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute here in Missoula. The Leopold Institute is an interagency program that works to provide leadership in the development of knowledge on diverse ecological and human values related to wilderness and other protected areas. Prior to joining the Leopold Institute in 1994, David worked for 21 years as a research scientist with the National Park Service and the National Biological Service and Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks in California, where he coordinated research on fire ecology and the effects of fire suppression in the Sierra Nevada. His research interests include restoration of fire to natural ecosystems, the impacts of recreational use in wilderness, the conduct of science in protected areas, and the application of science to policy issues and land management problems. He has served on the Ecological Society of America's National Park Ecological Research Committee as an associate editor of the journal Ecological Applications, and was recently reelected to the board of directors of the George Wright Society. David has a PhD in plant ecology from Stanford University. I'd also like to welcome Ann Black, who has a postdoctoral position as an ecologist working with Carol Miller at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute on fire research. Anne received her bachelor's degree from the University of Montana in the School of Forestry, and she was a student in the 1982 Wilderness and Civilization program. And so she's an alumni of the program that many of the students here tonight are part of. She has a master's degree in forestry and environmental studies from Yale and a PhD from the University of Idaho. She's worked for the Northern Plains Resource Council here in Montana, for Point Reyes Bird Observatory, for the Idaho Fish and Game, for the Nez Perce Tribe, and for the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And she returned to Montana in 2002 to join the Leopold Institute and work on fire research. So we're very lucky. On very short notice, Ann Black and David Parsons have agreed to talk with you about their work on fire. So please welcome our speakers.
Okay, are we on? Yeah. Okay, well, I know you're not supposed to start a lecture with an apology, but I really am sorry that Carol's not here. Ann and I just learned yesterday that she's having some potentially fairly serious health problems, and she just wasn't emotionally up to doing this tonight. And since we've been working fairly closely with her, it wasn't too much of a challenge to put some thoughts together, and we're going to tag team this a little. I'm going to start with some background on wilderness fire issues and efforts to try to restore fire and how we're doing, some of the challenges we're facing, and then just give you a little fundamental background. And then Ann's going to talk a little more specifically about some activities that we think may be useful in helping to resolve some of these dilemmas, mostly dealing with how science might be applied to some of these questions. So we've pretty much kept the main title that Carol presented, which is Restoring Wilderness Fire, Challenges and Opportunities, but we've, of course, as you might expect, put our own spins on this. As you know from basic ecology classes, fire is one of the most important natural disturbances affecting wilderness ecosystems. And it plays a myriad of roles and is clearly one of the important processes that affect natural ecosystems. The policies, the wilderness policies of the 4 federal land management agencies, the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, and the National Park Service all explicitly recognize the importance of fire as a natural process in wilderness. And they all encourage and support the use of fire, the maintenance of fire as a process, or the restoration of fire where that may be necessary. And federal fire policy, which is developed by a completely different group of people in wilderness policy, also supports allowing natural fire to burn wherever possible. The various federal fire policies that have come out over the years all talk about the important role fire plays and the importance of trying to maintain some of these natural roles of fire. At the same time, of course, they're trying to reduce hazardous fuels, etc. So wilderness areas and large parks like Glacier and Yellowstone, which have not, maybe Congress hasn't designated as wilderness, but are managed by the agencies as if they were, are clearly the places where we ought to have natural fire if we're going to have it anywhere. And I think there's a general perception that wilderness and similarly managed areas are relatively natural. They're relatively free of human influences, at least compared to the rest of our landscape. And there's a perception that natural ignitions are permitted to burn in most wilderness areas. In fact, the first, and I'll call them natural fire programs, although the terminology issue is something I'll come back to at the end, has been a tremendous challenge in wilderness fire. But the first programs which permitted lightning ignitions to burn, at least under certain conditions, not just freely. The first one was in 1968 in Kings Canyon National Park in the Sierra Nevada, the National Park Service program. And then 4 years later, the Forest Service, which had revised its policies in 1971 in principle to allow natural ignitions to burn, allowed their first one, a relatively small one, in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness here in Montana. So we have a pretty good history of 36 years of natural fire programs. So the result of allowing these fires to burn has been fire regimes, by which we mean sort of the characteristics of fire, the frequencies and intensities of which fire burns, and the resulting fire effects, whether it's on vegetation mosaics or wildlife or water. But these fire regimes are similar to those recorded in historical records. And we use fire scars on trees that have been burned successively through the years to help us date past fires. We use pollen and charcoal in sediments to see how fire and vegetation have changed. There are a number of great scientific techniques for this. So the perception is that in these wilderness areas, we allow most fires to burn, and we end up with relatively natural fire regimes. And in fact, by 1988, 50 Forest Service wildernesses and 26 national parks had approved programs for allowing natural ignitions to burn. So the program was progressing pretty well. The picture on the lower left is from the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, and there actually are fires in there dating from 1990, 1996, and I think 2000. So this mosaic across the landscape is something that managers have felt pretty good about, at least in these very large wilderness areas. This is some data from the National Park Service on lightning ignitions that they allowed to burn. And the acres per year, beginning in '68, when those first few acres were allowed in Kings Canyon, up through about year 2000, the data goes to here. But I think what's really interesting is to note the general progression of acres burned, acres treated, you might say, of fire until 1988. And then it dropped off precipitously. So what happened in 1988? Yellowstone, the big Yellowstone fires. The result of that was an immediate cessation of all the federal fire programs, both management ignitions and natural fire programs. There were no fires in 1989, and the program, as you can see, has come back online very slowly. 10 years later, the Park Service wasn't even close to where they had been in 1988. And this is because of a whole variety of reasons. But most of them have to do with restrictions that required you to, before you could allow a fire to burn, you had to pass a whole bunch of criteria. And they had to do with what else was going on in that part of the country, what kind of resources and manpower were available, what firefighters were available, what time of year it was, and the restrictions really got ratcheted down. So not only had the total acreage burned, but the average fire that fell into this category that was allowed to burn was only about half of what it had been prior to 1988. So similar things happened in a number of other big fire years, 96, 2000, and each year the constraints started ratcheting down and started getting tougher and tougher to allow any of these ignitions to burn. So the reality is, despite clear policy directions, most wilderness fires today are suppressed. Most wilderness areas do not allow natural fire, and about 26% of those do allow it under at least some conditions. And they have to have an approved fire plan that lays out the conditions under which they can consider allowing a lightning ignition to burn. And they're often quite restrictive. Many of those 26% of the areas have never allowed a fire to burn at all. Most of the program is focused in a few of the big parks and wilderness areas. The Bob Marshall, the Frank Church, the Selway Bitterroot, Yosemite National Park, Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, Glacier National Park, the big name ones are where most of the fire activity occurs. And even where they are allowed, it turns out most lightning fires are still suppressed. And these numbers are a little bit old, partly because I didn't know I was doing this until yesterday, so I didn't have time to try to update them. But for the 10 years prior to 1998, the Bob Marshall had a pretty progressive wilderness fire program. They still suppressed 81% of the lightning ignitions. So, and numbers were pretty similar in the Selway Bitterroot. There's all kinds of reasons they're suppressed. Most of these are driven by values outside of wilderness, by risks of private property and homes, or smoke and air quality issues. There's a lot of reasons that fires end up being put out. But as we continue to effectively exclude fire, some of what we think of as our most natural ecosystems are changing before our very eyes. So even as we're supposedly protecting them, we're getting this kind of transition in these open ponderosa pine forests of the Southwest, for example, into very dense, shade-tolerant fir understories with lots of dead fuel in the ground. So if you do end up with a fire, it's not going to be the kind of fire that would have burned in the picture on the left. It's going to be a different kind of fire than these systems are really adapted to. So the ecological and social risks tend to override the potential benefits of getting fire back in, and most of our decisions, it turns out, are risk-based. And I think this is something Ann's been working, and Carol have been working on, and that she'll talk to you a little more about. Risks to old-growth trees, to private property and homes that are maybe on the margins or near the boundaries. Smoke, I mentioned. There's a tremendous pressure to put out fires or not ignite fires when air conditions are such that you're going to get smoke stagnation. Those of you that were here in 2000 know what happened when the fires were burning in the Bitterroot Valley. None of the fires were within 40 or 50 miles of here, but I'll never forget the day, August 2nd, 3rd, 4th, somewhere right around there. I came to work in the morning, and it was, I didn't think too much about it. I know the fires were burning Hamilton, Darby, Sula. I walked outside my office at noon, and I couldn't see across my parking lot. The smoke had come in, and it was incredible. We had some of that last summer. And I mentioned before national fire planning and manning restrictions, but the new policies that seem to get updated after every year that there's a bunch of bad fires just further crank down the restrictions that we have to abide by. Now, in some places, fire suppression over the last century has contributed to I say, unprecedented accumulation of fuels. By that I mean fuel accumulations that really are not known to have occurred in the last several thousand years from our historical data, the changing in composition and spatial patterns of vegetation. We start losing our diversity, these patches, the patch mosaics, that fires that wandered through at a frequent interval would create. We start losing species. There's areas we're losing aspen, white bark pine because of fire exclusion. There's other communities where we start losing the seeds that they will only last in the soil for so long. So there's a number of issues that come up when we exclude fire for long periods of time. And then maybe is most important from the social perspective is when we do get fires in those systems, and we're not going to keep them out forever, they are uncharacteristically hot. And you might argue that some of the fires we've seen in some parts of the West in recent years are partly the result of these kinds of changes. This is a classic set of paired photographs from the Mariposa Grove in Yosemite National Park showing the ingrowth in the Sierra that had occurred over that 80-year period as a result of excluding fire. And it's also, I think, really important to remember that even when we do allow a significant number of these fires, lightning ignitions to burn, the ones that burn during the hottest and the driest parts of the year are the ones that we go in and try to suppress. So we really, those are probably ecologically the most significant ones historically, were the ones that tended to burn on the extremes. So the supposedly natural fires we're trying to allow tend to not be allowed when they get into these extreme conditions until eventually we end up with some kind of a really unnatural fire that's uncharacteristically hot. So what are our options in these kinds of conditions? We can accept what comes. We can sit back and keep suppressing most of the fires or all the fires. I think we're already starting to see some signs, but we don't know too much about this. We'll get new ecological trajectories. We'll end up with ecosystems, communities, plant species, compositions that have not previously existed, at least in the last several thousand years, in that area. Some people would argue that in wilderness that's just fine. We'll just take what comes, and that's what's so neat about wilderness. We're not in there trying to control what the results are. But that's going to come with increasing fire risks and some extreme fire events, very hot fires. Our other option is to attempt to restore some semblance of natural fire regimes and maybe even go farther and try to restore and maintain some semblance of some natural vegetation, what we think ought to be there. There's lots of problems with that approach also, of course. We can only do so much in restoration, and even in natural ecosystems are not static either. We know about climate change, and things are always changing out there. So we really have to think about what is it we're trying to manage these areas for. Is it some frozen in some point of time? Is it trying to allow natural processes to continue and then we just take what comes? Or is it just a complete hands-off and we'll take what comes? I've put quite a bit of effort into work on restoration of fire. As a biologist, I tend to lean a little bit that direction. In many cases, that has required management ignited fire, what we call prescribed fire, because natural fire is simply impractical. There's a lot of places we can't let them go anymore, or some of them we never could. So one option is to go in and set fires. Sometimes these only are needed once or twice to reduce the fuels or set back succession, and then you may be able to allow the natural ignitions to go again. In other cases, you may have to do this forever. Another possibility is to go in and do some mechanical manipulations of fuels. Again, hopefully only once, and you'd reduce the fuels and you could again use fire as a tool, but there are cases where that may not always be the case. Mechanical manipulation of fuels and vegetation is very controversial in wilderness. There are programs at Grand Canyon National Park to try to do just this, to go in with saws and reduce, actually physically take some of the vegetation out so you'll get a lower intensity fire when you do burn. Bandelier National Monument in northern New Mexico has a situation where if they allow fires to burn, they find that they're losing cultural historic artifacts through erosion that follows these fires. So they have proposed and have been involved to some extent in a very active mechanical manipulation of fuels issue. This is very controversial, and this has been protested and litigated. The restoration dilemma, as I call it, is what we have to face when when natural fire is not going to do the job for us. So should we allow, or should we remove these fuels that have accumulated in order to restore more natural conditions? Or is the increase in naturalness, we might say, setting the vegetation and fuels back to where they would have been maybe if we'd allow fires to burn, whether it's with prescribed fire or mechanical manipulation, is that worth the associated loss in what some might call wildness, the trammeling, the human interference? I mentioned this earlier. Is it better to just let things go, or should we be in there actively managing? And this is really one of the big controversies in wilderness management these days. But we also, I think, have to consider the question of what are the effects if we continue to suppress fires. It's not really just do hands-on or do nothing. So George Nickus from Wilderness Watch here in Missoula several years ago wrote an article where he was opposed to any use of prescribed fire management ignitions in wilderness. He found that more troubling in many ways than fire suppression is the growing tendency towards utilizing management ignited fire. When managers light the match, fire ceases to be a natural force and instead becomes a manipulative tool. That's a pretty interesting concept, and I think most managers dealing with issues out on the ground feel that fire suppression has caused such huge problems that we've got to go in and try to set fires or do something to reduce the fuel loads. But this is from the pure, what I would call the pure wilderness perspective, arguing against that maybe it's better not to do anything. And prescribed fire has some problems in itself. Interestingly enough, the Forest Service continues to largely prohibit the use of management ignitions in wilderness. The other 4 agencies in the Department of Interior, the other 3 agencies, all use prescribed fire quite regularly. And just to go back to where I worked for 20 years in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, much of it focused on trying to restore fire into the giant sequoia groves, some of which were wilderness, some of which weren't. Even in that situation, often we were referred to as one of the 3 or 4 model programs for restoration of natural fire in the country. We came to the conclusion several years ago that we have been unable to maintain historic fire frequencies, even with this very hands-on mixture of prescribed fire and natural fire. And in the sequoia groves, where excellent fire history, fire scar data tells us the natural return interval over the last 4,000 to 5,000 years, and was somewhere between 3 and 15 years in most places. We're now averaging about 75 years with our very intensive hands-on management. So even with this successful program, we're going to just perpetuate the conditions that got us all alarmed 20 years ago because of 75 years of fire suppression. So we have a real dilemma here. And I already mentioned some of the other complications. I mentioned smoke. But I didn't mention non-native species. We're finding in many areas, whether it's lightning or human ignitions, that fire is being followed by invasive species incursions. Cheatgrass in much of the West, rush skeleton weed. These are real difficult species to get rid of, and they often come in abundance after fire. So this is something that is even further complicating our challenge. So let me close by just mentioning a couple of challenges and needs that I have thought about. I mentioned terminology before. Since 1968, when that first lightning fire in Kings Canyon was allowed to burn, and it was called a let burn fire, We've gone through an incredible range of terminologies and terms. That one didn't last very long because it came with it a connotation of irresponsibility. You were just letting it go. And we moved into using natural fire, prescribed natural fire. It could only be allowed if there was a prescription for it, and that meant that you had some control and you had some expectation of what it would do. Then they went to wildland fire for resource benefits. That didn't go over very well in the press or with the public at all. People are thinking, what are you talking about? And now they tend to use wildland fire use, but I still think that causes a lot of problems. So we need to get our act together. We need to communicate what we're doing if we're going to have any chance of selling these kinds of programs. A few other points. I think we need to do a much better job of understanding what our options are in managing the fire in these areas and what the consequences of those different choices we have might end up being. I think science can do a lot for helping us play out some of those consequences through various modeling approaches. We need to consider benefits as well as the risks when we make decisions. Our decisions are all risk-based, and again, I think Anne will elaborate on this a little. We need to manage large landscapes. Too many of our wilderness and park areas are small, and many of the fires that would have affected them didn't even start within the current boundaries. So they're going to be suppressed for completely other reasons today. So that's a really difficult obstacle. We need to be place sensitive. We tend to overgeneralize. Just because ponderosa pine in one place never has crown fires and is characterized by frequent low intensity fires doesn't necessarily mean the same is true in another part of its range. But again, we tend to, managers, the press, we tend to pick up and overgeneralize. We need to really have data for the place we're talking about. We need to address social factors, people's knowledge and attitudes, their behavior, and trust, the trust they have or don't have in the federal government and in the agencies that are making these decisions for them. And we really need to clearly articulate what it is we're even trying to do out there. What are we managing wilderness for? Are we managing it to keep humans out and just let whatever happens happen? Or are we managing it to try to perpetuate, even if it takes some intervention, some vision we have of what it should be like, or maybe what it would be like today if we hadn't messed it up so bad. I don't think we've done that as a society very well. We haven't really gotten down to those difficult decisions. And then ultimately, I just say, how do we even know if we're successful? If we have goals and objectives clearly spelled out, we can go back and evaluate how we've done. But we need to do a lot better job of that. So I'm going to stop and let Anne take over, and after she's done, we'll have some time for questions and discussion.
Thank you. Now, do you hold this? Is that what you did? And I'm going to stand back here if you guys will allow me to. That way I can look at you and kind of keep track of where I am. So sort of picking up on some of the themes that Dave started with, I want to address a question of why are we in this situation? We've had 3 decades of federal policies that have been encouraging wildland fire use, and yet we see that they are still only partially and imperfectly in place. And so what I want to do is talk maybe a little bit about how we might conceptualize that sort of an issue, and then look specifically at some of the ways that we at the Leopold Institute are looking at trying to address these issues. So we might think of fire and decisions about fire as sitting sort of at the nexus of ecologic potential, social acceptance, and economic feasibility. When you start thinking about that, though, it's not just fire, it's the decisions about fire that sit there. So what I want to talk about is this fire decision space. And when we're looking at wildland fire use, natural ignitions, this decision space is really clearly defined. And that is within 2 hours after the first report of a natural ignition, federal wildland fire managers have to make a decision about whether or not they're going to let that fire burn as a wildland fire use or to suppress it. And it comes down to one person putting their name on that piece of paper. Now, the decision to suppress is irreversible. Once suppressed, that is the tactic. If you go wildland fire use, if the fire then starts to behave in a way that the managers don't really like, you can actually move into its suppression mode, which is what happens fairly frequently. But what I want to do is consider this decision space and what happens, all the facts and the pressures that come to bear on the few people and then the one person who actually has to put their signature on the line. So as you might suspect, there are a whole bunch of fairly obvious factors that come into play. Dave alluded to some of these with law, policy, and regulation. You have to have in your long-range management plan the specific ability to manage an ignition for wildland fire use. But that's not enough. If you can do that, you have to have a fire management plan that has been approved that also lays out specifically the conditions under which a natural ignition can be managed as a wildland fire use. So what you have to do is look and see, do I even have the option of wildland fire use? Many areas you don't, even in wilderness areas. And then you have to look at your weather conditions and your fuels conditions and see if those also are within this sort of prescription, even call it a prescription even for wildland fire use. Other issues come into play. What condition class? What are the fuels like out there? And what's the capacity or the potential for this fire to restore or maintain wildlife habitat or to destroy it? How close is this to the wildland-urban interface? What is your level of public trust and your interaction with the public who might be affected? Threats to private property are an obvious one. Incident costs may be something that those of you who haven't been involved in fire aren't so much familiar with, but in an attempt to try to keep suppression costs down or fire management costs down, one of the things that the manager needs to do is do a cost comparison. What happens currently, though, is that when you do this cost comparison, you have to look at what they call the campaign costs for wildland fire use. That is, if you think this ignition has a capacity to burn for 3 months, then you have to put in there all the costs associated with those personnel for that 3 months. On the suppression side, however, you're assuming that your initial attack is going to succeed. So you have these maybe apples and oranges sorts of economic issues there to deal with. In addition to that, you have a whole host of other issues and pressures that also come to bear upon the individual in this decision space. And these are some of the issues that we in the research community are really just starting to realize do have a great importance, and that maybe we have something that we can contribute here. For instance, organizational culture. I mean, who really thinks of that as being important in this managing fires and making this decision? It does. There's huge camaraderie. There's educational similarities. There are huge expectations that come from being within the suppression forces. That is part of that decision space. The manager's individual experience. How comfortable are they with fire? How comfortable are they with that particular ecosystem or the people who they work with? What is their own individual risk posture? Are they risk averse? Are they willing to put their careers on the line? Literally on the line by signing that go or no-go piece of paper. Another thing that I've heard more and more from wilderness managers, agency budgets and post-incident costs. Now, if you have a start in a wilderness area that in all likelihood is going to burn up a bridge that packers use, you're going to have to replace that. If you call it a suppression fire under current policy, you're probably likely going to be able to tie into the BEAR funds, the Burned Area Emergency Restoration and Rehabilitation. I always forget what R stands for. However, currently, if you call it a wildland fire use, you have no access to such funds. You have to find those funds in your own agency budget or be able to go out there and tell those packers and their hunters, sorry, you're just going to have to find another way across that creek because we don't have the funds to rebuild that bridge. is this fire going to increase or decrease your risk to firefighter safety today and tomorrow, your fuels reduction? It could go either way. We've had a lot of fire in the Northern Rockies. How much is enough? Do we have enough, basically, in many of these ecosystems for 10, 20 years? And of course, the old one is control even possible. Sometimes it's not, and we tend to try to project an image that we can control fires, and we can't. So within this, you can see that there are a lot of issues of knowledge, of sort of clarity of how we understand the problem, as well as of policy. And at the Institute, we're looking at our focus as being on that decision space and trying to provide support and information for those decision makers. We obviously cannot affect policy directly, but we can provide knowledge and clarity that then the policymakers can use to take a closer look and maybe to amend some of the barriers to getting fire on the ground. So the sorts of questions that we are looking at addressing include these cultural and institutional barriers to fire use. What are they, and how can research support this decision process? There's the obvious ecological issues that Dave also alluded to. What role has climate, has past management and other disturbances played not only in creating the current fire regimes, but in changing them as well? And issues of restoration, where is it necessary or possible, and what does it even look like? And then finally, on an individual perspective, and I have down here public acceptance, but such issues as knowledge and experience, your values and attitudes, your community norms, and your anticipated outcomes, they affect both the public's acceptance of fire, as well as that suppression community's acceptance of fire. And when we're looking at this go, no-go decision, I think looking at the decision makers, the managers, and the suppression forces from this social perspective will be very valuable. So what I'd like to do in just a few remaining minutes is hopefully not cause your eyes to glaze over, but to give you a couple of examples of how we are trying to fill some of these gaps at the Institute. And I'll use examples from 2 ongoing projects. The first one is we call BurnPro. It's a model that Carol Miller initially developed, and one of our colleagues, Brett Davis, has put a significant amount of work into. It's essentially looking at probability of burning, and we're using it, I'll show you the Selway Bitterroot, to try to identify how current policy is affecting the probability of burning. In other areas, we're helping managers identify whether there are even enough lightning ignitions to restore a historical fire regime. And interestingly enough, in places like Yosemite, you can actually start to tease out the extent to which anthropogenic ignitions actually help to create those natural fire regimes. And then the second model that I want to talk about is this fire effects planning model, which is one that's intended to help managers identify where and under what circumstances fire can convey benefits as well as risks. And third, that I want to raise, I don't have some slides on this just yet. It's a fairly new project, but we're spending more time working with managers and the public to try to understand those issues that affect public trust. And some of this work developed after the 2000 fires in the Bitterroot. So on the first aspect of this is BurnPro model. What you're looking at, and don't take too close note of the specific values here. The warmer colors are a higher annual probability of burning, and the cooler colors are a lower probability of burning. What we do in BurnPro is take historic ignition densities and then fire, distribute them as they occur over time, say through the fire season, and then look to see under no suppression where they might go. And then you add this all up, and you can see under no suppression where you're more likely to have fire, where on the landscape gets visited more often by fire. The difference between these two maps is that on your left shows all ignitions. On the right is actually those that occur during times in which managers can actually allow wildland fires to burn. Particularly in the boundary zones around the Selway Bitterroot, there are certain times of the year where you don't have the option for that go, no-go decision. It's just always suppression. So to help look at this a little bit more closely, let me see if I can use this. Okay, so let's look at these two bottom ones. That doesn't really work very well, does it? Okay, versus these two top ones. What you'll notice is that there's a reduction from the warmer colors to the cooler colors in both of them. But they differ. Here you see still a fairly high probability of burning. This is 0.5 to 0.6. Whereas up here you're down to like 0.02. What that means is that even if, well, the consequence of not taking advantage of a wildland fire use opportunity down here are a lot less than up here. Because even under natural conditions, you don't get very many ignitions up here. So if you let that one go, you might not have another opportunity for many, many years. Whereas down here, you actually have a fairly high probability of burning. So if the report comes in of a start and there's lots of things happening around the area, you might decide down in the lower portion, let's just suppress that, we won't have to deal with it, we'll get another opportunity to have a natural fire in the next 10 years or so. Now, the middle one is actually outside the wilderness boundary. We buffered the wilderness by some distance. And so this really shows you the effect of suppression, which is pretty dramatic. And you can imagine that there would be significant buildup of fuels if you have essentially what you've done is to say, you're suppressing all of this. And so relatively speaking, your probability of burning is going from 0.8 down to somewhere in here, 0.1, 0.03. So that's a model that we're using to help particularly in that go, no-go decision, but also in the planning of where do we really want to try to take advantage of fires and where do we have opportunities for a little bit more wiggle room. So the fire effects planning model takes a slightly different tactic. Here what we do is we use existing fuels and weather information and existing programs that managers are familiar with to generate information on fire behavior and fire effects. And we're further stratifying that to do this under different threshold weather conditions. And these are conditions that are meaningful for fire management and fire tactics on the ground. So here what we did, this is actually on the Bitterroot face, is to look at what the potential impact on lynx foraging habitat would be under under different fire weather conditions. And what you can do with this model is to develop these suites of what we call map libraries that show you what the potential effects are of fire at these different fire weather conditions on any one of your targets that you have in your long-range planning documents or your more site-specific ones. So fire-adapted cover types, firefighter safety, watersheds. Well, what do you do with these once you have them? How does this, where can this actually help you in the management process? Well, if you think about those three, that map library, you have extreme, very high, and then moderate potential. If you query down, so you sum up sort of through all of those in a GIS, what you end up with is a map that helps you identify where under any fire type you're going to have benefits on the landscape, and alternatively where fire is always going to confer risks and where you have sort of other opportunities in the middle. So you could use this both to look at wildland fire use, to look at areas for prescribed fire, to look at areas that may need mechanical treatments prior to the reintroduction of fire. You could use that on an annual basis, or if you wanted to, you could look and use this sort of a process to help you identify what your priorities and your strategies are in your long-range planning, like the forest plan revision process. So you could say, well, if we took these priority areas and we treated them, what would conditions be like in another 10 years in terms of our target conditions? You could also use this to help you identify your wildland fire use zones for your fire management plans. And here, this is just a little thought experiment looking at where there's predominantly surface fire under lower fire weather conditions and where there's crown fire predominantly at very high conditions, and thinking, well, that might be one way you could sort out the landscape and say, under these conditions in these areas, wildland fire use is an option. And you'll notice, and this is actually what a lot of folks on the Bitterroot National Forest have been saying, is wildland fire use does not necessarily have to be within wilderness only. If we have it in our toolbox outside these areas, doesn't mean we have to use it, but it gives us an option. And then finally, you can use this at the incident level. So at the fire level, what you can do is you could pull out of this stack of maps the effects for the fire weather condition most similar to the one that you're facing. And then take your perimeter, your expected fire perimeter, your maximum manageable area, and drop it over there and say, do I have a net benefit or a net loss to this particular species or this particular target? Alternatively, if you are in a suppression event, why shouldn't you be able to use something like this to identify the flanks of the fire that really need the attention of the suppression forces, so that you can actually get some cost containment but also some ecological benefits by looking at the fire from that holistic perspective, not just risks to life and property, but risks to ecosystems and benefits to ecosystems. So that's a quick whirlwind through some of the projects that we are currently involved with. We have a number of different ideas on how to address some of these other issues relating to barriers to wildland fire use and getting more fire on the ground. And with that, I'll just say thanks. That's our formal presentation, and be happy to take questions.
Are there any strategies right now within any of the agencies to combat the weeds after the fires go through? Are they doing anything?
I don't know of anything that is a national sort of strategy. Certainly it's something that I think the districts and the managers, the local managers look at after a fire. It's certainly part of one of the issues they look at in terms of where to restore, where restoration might be necessary. That tends to be more under suppression events. Dave, do you know?
I don't know, do I have to turn this on? It's on. Oh. Well, that's a really excellent question. I think it's really been relatively recently that people have really begun to understand the magnitude of this problem, and I think there's a lot of people studying options, including biocontrol, but I don't think there's a very good answer out there, and it may, again, be kind of site-specific and definitely species-specific. So I think it's one of the huge challenges of the next decade or so.
One of the mandates of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act is that community wildfire protection plans be drafted. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, how could community members offer helpful information, and also how could community members complicate matters?
Oh, that's much more in your arena.
Well, it's easy to complicate matters. I'm just trying to think of
I think this is a place where this question of trust comes in. I think one of the things that's really become apparent to the federal agency folks just in the last few years is that people out there don't trust their decisions, and they don't trust them. And I think the federal managers have a big job ahead of them, and until they can really do something about that gap, they're going to have a hard time getting effective community involvement. I think some of the community doesn't want to be constructive if they don't trust the people that they're trying to work with. there's lots of ways it can be helpful, but I don't know. It's going to be interesting to watch this play out. You know, I will say, as having worked for the federal government for over 30 years now, for several different agencies, I think, for the most part, by far, the majority of the people I have dealt with on the ground that are out there at the district and the forest levels are incredibly committed and well-intentioned and want to do the right thing for the land. It's a completely different vision than what I often read about in the papers, and about, you know, we can't trust those people and they went back on their word, et cetera. It's something, being a researcher who's not out in the field, it's really hard for me to put those two together, and I don't really know where the truth is, I guess. But I think there's an awful lot of really committed people working for these agencies, and they need all the support they can get from the public.
And everything that I've read and all the people I've talked to, whether they're scientists or managers, all concur that there is nothing like one-on-one conversations to try to build trust and build relationships. Now, I think one of the challenges is you also have to be talking to someone who can make a decision and make that decision stick. And I think that there are challenges on both the agency side for that and also on the public side. We've seen good collaborative efforts blow up because the person who was at the table was not ultimately the one who could control what their representatives could do. And we've seen that from both the public side and the agency side. Yep.
I was wondering if you guys could address how post-fire salvage logging fits into the ecologic, social, and economic diagram.
Sure, I'm sorry. He was asking us to address how post-fire salvage logging fits in. It fits in all of those. I mean, to be successful, it has to be economically feasible, it has to be socially acceptable, and the ecosystem is the one least able to speak for itself, but there should at least be some sort of ecologic potential. You know, obviously when we're talking about wilderness areas, that's not even an option. So I don't think I really addressed your question, but I'm not quite sure where you were trying to get us to go. Yeah.
I'm curious if how politics and economics have affected fire policy in the past. Thousands of jobs created by force, by firefighters, and if you've witnessed in the past any political pressures to keep fire suppression going, if you could speak to that a little bit.
You know, I don't think I've directly witnessed that, but I will have to tell you, just sometime maybe 2 months ago, there was a big story in the Missoulian about when the first predictions of this being another drought, big fire year were coming together. It was coupled with a story about the incredible growth in. I'm not sure what the right word is, but of small businesses around the West, including in Montana, that now live off of the fires, that provide the showers and the washrooms for the firefighters, that provide the food for the firefighters, that provide, you know, all of these various needs. And the gist of the article, basically, as I recall, was they were really getting excited if this was going to be another big fire year. So, you know, I think this potentially is a pretty big economic factor in what would happen if we suddenly had 5 years of cool, moist weather and no fires. It'd be a lot of these small companies would be going out of business. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. Now at the national level, It's hard to say. You know, you may have heard, for those of you that haven't, I'll just explain briefly, but for 3 years in a row now, the Forest Service in particular, but also the Bureau of Land Management have, when they get into the fire season, have had funds transferred from other accounts in order to fight fires these last few years. And it's because Congress has basically decided, whereas in the past, they gave the agencies essentially a blank check where they spent whatever was needed and then they reimbursed them. Several years ago, they decided, no, we're going to give them some level of appropriations, and if they get that matches kind of an average fire year, and if they need more than that, they're going to have to find it within their agencies. And we may or may not repay them the next year. And this is actually, it's really been crippling to the agencies the last couple of years, because come June or July, suddenly their recreation programs, their revegetation programs, their exotic species programs, these things are suddenly brought to a halt. People are told they can't travel anymore. All free dollars are routed over to fight these fires. And some years we've gotten the money back, and some years we haven't. And it's no way to run a business, let me tell you. I think I hope there's a solution in the works for the next couple of years, but that was I think that was in part a backlash because of a perception among, I don't know, of Congress, and I don't know how they got it, but the perception that the agencies would spend all the money they could, whether it was a low fire year or a big fire year. They'd buy all new fire trucks if it was a low fire year, and all this new gear, and they'd modernize everything. And basically, it was just this big pit of this big sucking sound of vacuum of spending all the money they possibly could. And there was a lot of waste in it. And I'm sure to some extent that was true. Now, what the way to deal with that is, I'm not sure, but the one they came up with is kind of a meat cleaver approach that hit a lot of people that I don't think it was intended to hit.
That's a really good question, though, and I think one of the reasons on that one slide where I put up sort of the obvious issues that come to bear on the decision space versus the others is the less direct ones. I think that sort of a question hits at those less direct issues. And I mean, I'm a postdoc with the Forest Service. That means I'm sort of like a little fly that's sitting there on the outside, and my tenure there is not assured by any means. And that's both positive and negative. I'm really excited by what I see actually in the Forest Service, because there is more and more acknowledgement and interest in taking a look at some of these other indirect influences, and really not to kind of take off the blinders and not look at things, you know, that old analogy to the toolbox. You know, you can't, if you open up the toolbox and all you have is a hammer, well, everything in the world is a nail. And, you know, to a certain extent, I think that's been part of the problem in looking at why we can't get more fire on the ground. We got to put more tools in the toolbox. And so I see much more openness to taking other perspectives and looking at things in a little different perspective. And that would be that's a real obvious one from my perspective to take a look at. Because I think, you know, if we're looking at risks and benefits, yeah, I mean, the old way that the fire costs and values at risks are actually identified is by looking at timber losses and 2 years loss of grass. And they're all commodity values that are put into this cost estimation in terms of loss. Well, obviously, there are lots of other things besides that. What about the increased grass after 2 years? You know, what about the fuels reduction and the thinning projects that fire might actually provide for you? So there are lots of other more comprehensive types of costs, benefits, and risks that you could put into this system.
Yeah, I want to make one other comment that I was reminded of during that discussion. And Ann and I both talked about risks some, but I don't think we can overemphasize enough how risk aversion plays into the decision-making of fire managers. The reality is that you can get yourself in a heck of a lot of trouble if you allow a fire to burn or if you set a fire and it gets away. the Cerro Grande fire that burned a good chunk of Los Alamos, New Mexico several years ago is an excellent example, but there's lots of other ones. You know, the reality is that was a prescribed fire that they went out and set. It wasn't intended to be very big. The weather changed. Yeah, maybe somebody didn't do as good a job as they might have in forecasting that potential outcome, but it did get away from them. And the park superintendent lost his job, as did several other people that were involved in the decision to set that fire that day. And everybody was out to get him. I mean, the word came down from the Secretary of Interior, Secretary Babbitt at the time, that somebody has to go. There has to be a scapegoat. Well, if that's the potential result of taking a little bit of a risk, and if it goes awry, how many managers are going to take that risk in the future? Not very many. So there is no system built, no incentives built into the system to encourage people to be a little bit risky. All they can really do is lose. Yep, up top.
I've spent about the last 16 years, a big part of the summers in Bitterroot Selway, watching the PNFs. This mostly an observation and then just seeking your comment, because I don't think there's necessarily an answer to this issue from what your perspective might be. And I trust that some of the models that the Bitterroot Forest uses are coming from researchers like you all to monitor the PNFs in the Bitterroot. And I know that when they get to certain parameters, they're ready to suppress to keep conflagrations from occurring, because I've witnessed fires that have eaten up 50,000 acres in the Bitterroot Selway in 2 days. They'll run a half a mile in 15 minutes. And clearly they're not suppressible. They're like Yellowstone Park fires. And the Bitterroot has a plan. They're following PNFs. They're following parameters laid down by computer models in that. But it seems like virtually any hot, intense fire season, they can watch good constructive PNFs all season long. They'll be burning for many weeks, and constructively, when it comes time to manage or corral, it's usually the time when the fire season is heated up all over the West, including Montana, the Bitterroot, the rest of the state, and the wilderness is always left to fend for itself. So the models in that just seem to be hopelessly left in the air because all the priorities are pulled from wilderness. The whole notion of managing PNFs is thrown out the window. So I just see it as a perpetual problem, and I know you all don't have the responsibility to that. I don't know if you have any comments or observations about the problem.
I guess the one anecdote I have is sort of on the opposite side. I've heard that incident commanders will jockey for position for these resources, and they'll try to call them early, or they will call something a suppression event early before the fire really might demand it, in order to try to call resources in. And it's, again, one of these issues that is very subtle, but seems to have a tremendous effect. And that is, you know, am I going to need the resources, or can I get the resources when I need them? And maybe what I need to do is hedge a little bit and order more resources early, and just hold them there and leave them sitting on the tarmac someplace until I need them. And there doesn't seem to be, I guess the GACC's, the Geographic Area Command Center system, helps to address that a little bit. But there's all sorts of levels of status, I think, as well, both in terms of the personalities involved, as well as the political areas where the fires are, and then the management areas. So wilderness, yeah, it's not going to get the resources when they're private homes somewhere else that might need them. And it's all part of this crazy dynamic.
I think your point's well taken, and I think it's really become increasingly obvious over the last 10 years or so, as we've had a number of really serious fire years. I think the wilderness fires do largely get abandoned at that point. And, I don't know. Ultimately, it may mean they're going to allow fewer of them to ever even get going to get to that point because of the potential for them to escape and do damage. I really feel that what we're really facing here is we need to start talking about the fact that natural fire regimes in most of these wilderness areas are probably not very practical, and we need to start thinking about, okay, what do we want these areas to be like then?
It seems like fires have been getting, larger, and I don't know if this is perception or a reality, but like in the 70s and the 80s, like the 10,000, 20,000 acre fires were pretty good size. By the time we got to the Yellowstone, how big was the Yellowstone? 83,000 or something?
Oh, it was much bigger than that.
There's
It's in the
several-
millions.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's, maybe it is just a perception, but last year we had about 500,000 acre fires down in Arizona, and the year before in Oregon, and the early 90s we had a couple of 100,000 acre fires. But the thing is that a lot of landscape seems to be burning up. Is this doing any good to reintroduce a mosaic in the larger scale landscape?
One would think yes. Actually, though, I just got some money to take a look at that issue. And the question that I want to look at is whether suppression tactics are changing the landscape structure of our forests as opposed to natural fires. And I think I'm not actually sure what the answer will be. Simplistically, you could say, well, yeah, fire lines tend to be real sharp edges, very hard, and tend to be straight, and we tend to do burnout conditions and other such things. And so you might easily posit that suppression events are going to result in a simpler landscape structure and less internal mosaic. Maybe that's a case for some of these fires that we can actually control. When these fires completely escape control and burn until the weather puts them out, I think it's probably a lot more money, but I'll have fun looking at it. I'll get back to you.
I think the mosaic the mosaic created by smaller fires has definitely helped control some of the bigger ones. But the reality is, we're going on 6-7 years of drought and warm temperatures that we haven't had in a long, long time. And there's still a huge amount of landscape out there that has not burned in the last 50 or even 100 years. I find it kind of interesting to look back and read about 1910, which is the largest fire year in record by a long shot in the Northern Rockies. And that was, you can hardly blame that on fire suppression, having created all these fuels. We hear today, all we have to do is go in and thin out the understory and around our homes because we've been putting out fires for too long. How did those fires get so big in 1910? I think one thing we're learning is those were wind driven. They were dry, hot winds, and if you get that kind of weather, it doesn't really matter what else you've done. Most forests, even those that burned 10 years ago, are going to burn again. And
Do those burn in like ponderosa pine? Do they destroy ponderosa pine or stand maintenance fire regimes?
well, it's not. Yes, but yeah, they pretty much hit every vegetation type, I think. They're not very typical fires, but they did happen, and they could happen again.
Well, in their ecosystem setting, too. I mean, that's something that we're still trying to learn about, which is, what role do they play? We tend to think of fire regimes as, it's a low intensity, or it's a surface burning regime that has a return interval of 15 to 25 years. It's typical, in the ponderosa pine. Well, we're finding out that there generally may be one dominant type of fire in a habitat. But more often than not, there's another one or two types that are layered in there at different return intervals. So with ponderosa pine, we're finding that across the West, it's not that unusual, actually, to find crown fire so areas that were ponderosa, are ponderosa, and experienced a crown fire, a significant sized crown fire at some point in the fairly recent past. Now, how those layers in and how the management community tries to meld those sort of multiple fire regimes together to manage a specific piece of property is a real good question.
When you were talking about options for management, which seems very open and fluid at the moment, I heard three at least. One sounds like the Wilderness Act itself, something that once existed. Then another you mentioned was letting natural processes work naturally, and then the third was just let what happens happen. As someone who's worked a long time in this area, what is your sort of personal feeling or thoughts about which of those should go, or should all three be used?
Well, my bias is strongly towards trying to restore as much of the process as we can, which would mean to try to get fire back into those systems, burning in similar frequencies and intensities that they might have prior to our intervention with suppression. I'm not an advocate of picking an endpoint, a vegetation type or forest structure that you're trying to perpetuate, because I think those have always changed, and I'm not an advocate of hands off and take what comes. However, I have to say that the older I've gotten, the more I've begun to realize what I thought was such a logical solution is maybe not all that practical, and I think we need to revisit that. I don't know. I think we're going to have to. I'm not a hands-off person, but at the same time, I do worry we can over-manipulate these, we can over-control and manage these areas. So I'm actually struggling with that right now. I think, it would be a great topic for this group to have a session on. There, and then I saw a hand over here. Go ahead.
Oh, just a quick question about the incomplete combustion created by those prescribed fire early in the season, like in the spring or late winter. Does it have any adverse effect in like late season, because it could create like a drier fuel?
Well, that's an excellent. I think what you're asking is when you do burn primarily prescribed fires, often we find they're set during the spring or the fall, not during the peak fire season. So I think there's all kinds of potential effects that could potentially be ecologically just as disruptive as not burning at all, or burning with an uncharacteristically hot fire. There are certain species that respond differently to different times of the year. Soil can respond differently. So I don't think we know too much about that, but I think there are some places where that probably is a problem. You go in and do a lot of prescribed burning, you do it all at a time of year when fires didn't naturally occur, you may be changing that system substantially. Somebody over here had a...
You addressed it.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I guess a lot of the talk so far and policy is based on the fact that we can decide whether or not to control everything. And I guess, okay, I'll just assume that climate is changing. Most of us might agree with that. And so we may be getting some of these ecosystems are going to be getting drier and hotter. And we've already seen that many fires already are out of our control. We're able to control a lot of them, but we still can't. And so large areas get burned. Is this something we should be, grappling with, that maybe we can't control everything? And then associated with that is, should we still keep spending as much and more money to keep trying even though we fail?
Those are great questions. I think we better start thinking that maybe we can't control things. We haven't done a very good job in the past, and it seems like it's getting harder and harder, not easier and easier. Whether we should keep trying or not, I think as long as there are no incentives against people building, most of the problems ultimately come down to where homes are located along the end and along the edge of the forest. And, I know some of the insurance companies have started to look at that situation. People have generally assumed that the federal government will come bail them out if their fire is in danger, and you've probably all seen pictures of these fire trucks parked in people's driveways and defending their homes. So the people fled. Yeah, I don't know I don't think that's a very sustainable system, and it's probably not a very cost-effective system.
There's some really interesting work that's happening looking at climate and fire interactions. And one of the reasons why people are interested in this is because apparently in the global circulation models that are used for global climate change analysis, we still really don't have a good handle on carbon storage, terrestrially or in the oceans. And fires undoubtedly had a huge effect on that. And some of that work, I think, even in the Northwest, Paul Hesburgh out at PNW has been doing some really neat analysis looking at the effect of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And then Todd Kipfer, who's a PhD student at Bozeman, is looking at the Yellowstone ecosystem and how there's an Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. It's really cool stuff. All of what this is doing is helping us gain an understanding of how climate has varied over time and how the fire regimes have varied over time. And so we're picking up more clues as to how our systems may respond if things continue to get drier. The other side of your question, I think, is it's up to us as citizens. I mean, at some point, we're just going to have to convince the elected officials that this is ridiculous. Otherwise, it's not going to stop. And so with that, to me, that's not really an issue of science or research. It's more an issue of being citizens and forming an opinion and then making sure that that is heard. Yep.
I'm currently involved in revising the forest plan on the Wallowa National Forest, and I know we talk a lot about these issues about fire suppression and everything else. It seems like we're spending millions of dollars a year trying to suppress fires we can't suppress. But all the Forest Service research shows and is working towards trying to assess what risk management is and trying to assess how to better fight these fires. How would you suggest going about trying to change the Forest Service attitude about suppressing fires versus letting them go? And I guess the thing that I'm really asking is, what would you say would be the best plan of action to try to get the Forest Service to try to change their mind about fire suppression versus just letting it burn?
Don't think that it's monolithic. I think that there are undoubtedly some groups that are doing that sort of research. Certainly the stuff that we're looking at takes a very different approach, looking at benefits as well as risks. And I think that it's also, again, it gets down to what can people do locally and what are they constrained by nationally. And so just having those conversations, those honest conversations with the planners or the fire folks or the district rangers to say, essentially what is within your power to do? What is our decision space here? And so to make sure that you're working with the person, you're working to ask an individual to do something that is within their power to do. And if you need to ask a different question or to get a different outcome, then maybe you need to talk to an individual at a different level. And so to not lump everything together, but sort of try to partition it out and figure out who actually and where actually you need to be working with on the particular issues.
I have to tell a quick story. Last fall, I was down in California, actually in Yosemite National Park, and we were on a field trip with the fire management officer, and Yosemite has a very, very progressive and has for some time both prescribed fire and natural fire program, but they struggle mightily with they have to get permission on each one of those fires, whether to set or to allow a lightning fire to burn in the high country from the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley Air Quality Control Board, the local counties. And increasingly, because of summer air stagnation and air quality problems in the Central Valley, California, it's been very difficult in recent years to get them to approve very much fire. And he said he used a different tactic last year, which was to talk about them, if you continue forcing us to put out these fires and not setting fires to make up for those that we do put out, we're increasing the risk, the fuel loadings and the risk of big fires that are going to burn, they are going to burn someday. It's really a question of when, not if. And he used the argument of firefighter safety and the potential lives that could be lost in big fires if they don't stay on top of this with smaller piecemeal actions. And he said it actually got their attention, and they got a few burns proved you didn't think they would have otherwise. And it's kind of an interesting angle.
You talked quite a bit about public trust, and I wonder what role you think ecology education plays in developing that public trust, and if the agencies have addressed that very well.
Where's Carrie? We have a gal on our staff who actually got her PhD in environmental education. I'm sure it plays quite a role. I can give you some ideas, but I can't answer your question because I haven't really looked at it. But from what I've seen, I think that we definitely also need to look at what are these elements of public trust. How much of it is one-on-one experience with individuals, or experience or family members' experience with fire, with other officials? How much of it is education, and what sort of education or knowledge does a person have about that ecosystem? And is their knowledge actually imported from another ecosystem that works differently, or do they actually seem to have a reasonable understanding of the system in which they're looking, and is that the same as what the public officials have? And I think that what we can do is we can help the managers and the public sort of identify all these various issues, and so to help the managers understand maybe how they could take a more active role in building that trust, or in responding to the level of knowledge that people have.
Okay, we probably should wind down.
Yeah, I have a quick announcement, but first let's thank our speaker